I've got a really big treat in store for you guys. I'm reviewing an absolutely beautiful sword from LK Chen, one of the most, possibly the most beautiful replica sword that I've had in a very, very long time. Keep watching. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now, I've got somewhat of a treat for you, at least I think it's a treat. It's something which is a new type of sword to this channel. It's also a new manufacturer who hasn't been really featured on this channel before, and a new bit of history and an entire new culture for me, and almost for this channel. And that is, we're going into the far back world of 2,000 years plus ago in China and looking at a fantastic new sword from LK Chen. So what I have here is, I kid you not, probably one of the nicest replica sword that I have received from any manufacturer for quite some time. And it is the LK Chen Magnificent Chu Jian. As some people might say Jian, but I've been corrected and it's pronounced Jian, or something close to that anyway. And it's from the Chu dynasty. That means it's a type of sword which was in use more than 2,000 years ago. We're talking about 300 to 200 BC. What this is a type of sword that came in. It does have a steel blade. Okay, a very beautiful steel blade, which we'll look at in a minute. And it is a straight double-edged steel bladed sword. The design of this particular type of Jian is very much based on the Bronze Age Jian that went before it. So that's right, although this is a steel bladed sword and is essentially new technology for the time, when they had this access to this material and they'd worked out how to make it into functional blades, very functional blades, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well, they literally just carried on the stylistic, the design, the traditions that they'd built for the swords that they were already using, and they carried it on in this new metal, that being steel. This particular sword is based on various original swords that were excavated archaeologically between about the 1950s and 1980s, and those date to about 300 to 200 BC, so about 315 to 221 BC. Now, I've mentioned that this is a Jian, that is, it is a straight double-edged sword. I will look at the scabbard in a bit, but I'll just put it to one side for now. So it is a straight double-edged sword with double fullers. We'll have a little bit more close look at the blade in a bit, and it is a one-handed sword, and I must tell you that it feels absolutely fabulous in the hand. It moves around beautifully. That's not to say that it's super light. It's about 760 grams if I remember correctly, so it's a similar weight to something, if we're comparing something we'd often look at on this channel, something akin to a side sword type thing, certain types of rapier, light rapier it has to be said, or even a medieval one-handed sword at the lighter end of the spectrum, or indeed a 19th century military sword, but it is relatively light. A lot of those swords I've just mentioned would be more like 800, 900, 1,000 grams. This is only 750-ish, 760 grams. And it moves, it tracks absolutely beautifully. It's got an absolutely beautiful feeling to it, and is very, very nicely made. I'll look at some more of those details in a minute. But despite the fact that this handles beautifully just as simply as a one-handed sword, and I'd be happy to use it as a one-handed sword in any sort of scenario, battlefield or duel or anything else, it is probably principally, it is a battlefield weapon in this period, and it is principally designed to be used with a shield. Now, very much unfortunately, I don't own a replica of a Chu dynasty Chinese shield, but they are very, very interesting objects in their own right, and are obviously used with spears and other types of polearm, and used with these swords. So these are supposed to be used with shields, but equally they were carried in civilian life and they were used by themselves some of the time as well. Now, I do have a Roman shield here with me, which is, although it's roughly, in fact this is a later period one, but although we're kind of in the relatively right ballpark for period, this is a very, very different style of shield to what was being used in China during the time of this sword. So this is really just to reiterate that we should be comparing it with swords that are intended to be used with shields, like the later Sparta, Roman Sparta, or even the gladius, or various other types of sword that were used in the ancient world with large shields. This was supposed to be used with a large shield. But just to go back to my previous point, nevertheless, even without a shield, it is a very, very sweet handling sword, and you could absolutely use this by itself as well. Now, it is important to state that steel swords, this technology, was very, very famous and highly reputed in its own time. So the Chu dynasty were famous for their swords, and this is recorded in many records from the area. And these swords were used at the same time as bronze swords. I don't own a Chinese bronze sword, but if we look at European bronze swords, this is obviously a leaf-bladed sword, Ewart Park type, made by Neil Burridge. But you've got to recognise that the movement from bronze to steel wasn't a sudden overnight movement. Obviously, when iron started to be smelted and used for tools, there was an overlap period, a very, very big overlap period. And these swords in China, these Chu dynasty Jian, were being used alongside and against, in many cases, the bronze swords that looked very similar to them. Very, very similar design, but made of bronze instead of steel. And steel offers some mechanical benefits. It can be made harder and tougher, and it can be made springy, whereas bronze, as you probably know, if you bend it to a certain point, it will stay bent. So quite simply, you can make a tougher blade and a stronger blade out of steel than you can out of bronze. Let's just have a little look at the characteristics of this sword, which were carried over from the bronze swords into these steel swords. So first of all, we have the particular cross-section of the blade, and it is a very, very beautiful one, I have to say. So you've got double fillers, and then you've got the edge bevels either side. It leads to a very stiff section, but also relatively light for its stiffness. And then it's essentially a slightly tapering blade with distal taper down this way. Starts at about 7 millimeters here, goes down to about 3 or 4 millimeters, and then a relatively strong and reinforced point at the end. But really the characteristic of this is these double fillers along the blade. And I should also mention that this steel, it does have a complex structure. It is pattern welded in this particular case. And it does seem that the original steel swords were made certainly by folding, and this has been found from archaeological found examples that have been repolished and then etched. So we know that they were putting complex structures into their steel to try and get the maximum benefits of hardness versus toughness into their sword blades. Incidentally, I also mentioned I would talk about the strength of the sword blades and the technology of the steel. We also know from Chu and Han Dynasty archaeologically found swords, in some cases people have flexed them and shown that they do have a spring temper. So obviously that's fairly controversial with a very, very old sword, but some people have them in private collections and have done that, and it has been photographed and video being done. So at least, if not all, at least a lot of these swords had a spring temper to them. In terms of the hilt, again, this is a continuation from the Bronze Age designs. So we have what's essentially a sort of disc pommel. Now, a lot of you may have seen images from museums of these swords, and clearly, and not in every case, because I do know of one example where the fabric remains on the archaeologically found sword. But in most cases, the organic material from the grips is completely missing, so we're just left with a guard, a tang, and a pommel piece. And the pommel piece is generally attached by having a sort of lips that come down over the end of the tang with a rivet through. Okay, so it's a very strong method of attachment. And very often you see the tang going up here, and then the pommel seems to jut out very suddenly, and you're used to maybe seeing that shape from museums, but you have to remember that the grip would have, as in the case of this one, would have gradually gone up to meet that disc. So the disc doesn't necessarily jut out by itself, but is rather the grip is shaped up to it and butts up against it. And then the style of the guard, again, this is very much emulating the earlier Bronze Age swords. And this has an inscription on it in old script, which essentially means gentleman, I believe, or gentleman warrior or something like that. And at the bottom there, you can see the nice detail. These are incidentally bronze, these fittings, and very, very finely cast. And hopefully now you can see the pattern in the steel there on this beautifully double fillered blade. Very, very nice blade. very finely made, and you can also see how well the blade, how snugly the blade fits into the crossguard. So I said I would look at the scabbard as well, and the scabbards with these at LK Chen have really excelled and really pushed the envelope in making a complete unit. They haven't just made a sword, but the parts of the scabbard survive archaeologically as well, so they have replicated those very closely, as accurately as you possibly can do with all of the remaining parts that survive archaeologically. And the two things marry together and fit together absolutely beautifully. I just want to show the quality of the fit as the guard butts up against there. There is absolutely no gap really to speak of there. They're very, very nicely done, and you'll see that it's decorated with a traditional period correct design. And then this mount here, which is bronze bound to the scabbard as it should be done. We know that's done from statues and other artwork from the period. I will talk about this in a second and how that works. And then coming along here, you'll see that it's shaped wood that transitions from this flattened diamond section to an oval cross section, and we know from a surviving example that that is also accurate, and that's what it's modelled on. And then we've got this very nice shape or drag at the end as well, with its period correct motifs. These are modelled on original bronze fittings which survive from archaeologically found examples. So to explain what this bronze mounting is on the outside of the scabbard, or kind of loop, it's quite simply a belt loop. You may have guessed that anyway, but it's a rather simple and ingenious but also very strong and effective way of attaching the scabbard to a belt or sash or any other sort of form of thing around your waist. So I just pulled out a random belt here to give you an idea of, make sure it goes the right way around, there we go, give you a random idea, quick idea of how this works. Very, very simple. Funnily enough, this an image of a Chinese, I think it's a general actually rather than a soldier, wearing one of these is sometimes used as evidence of back scabbards or swords being worn at the back, but not really. It's kind of worn on a belt, but essentially it would be worn there. And that's pretty much how it's shown. And you'll notice that by moving it around to different places, so you can either slide it around to the front and have it in a very similar position really to where we find Japanese swords worn tucked through the sash or obi, or it can be, if it's in the way, if you're using a shield, just grab a shield here and you're using a big spear, then clearly if you want to get the thing out of the way, you can slide it around to the back, and now it's no longer in the way because it's at the back. So it's a very simple and effective way of wearing the sword. If you're traveling around, it's completely out of the way there. You can't draw it so easily if they're in that position, but actually it's not too bad. You can grab the hilt of it pretty quickly there and get it around to the front and get the sword out. So it's a pretty effective but also simple way of wearing the sword, and it was how these swords were worn in this period. So hopefully that's given you a little outline of where these swords sit in history and how important they are actually. Pretty much the first steel swords used in China and used extensively in the Chu dynasty, and based very much on the bronze Jian that went before them. But how does this particular replica by LK Chen stack up? How good is it as a sword? How good is it as a replica of the original objects? Well, the first thing I really want to say is that LK Chen are absolutely leading the way in replicating ancient Chinese swords. I don't really know anyone else who is going out there studying the original artifacts and making copies of them one for one. This isn't one of their one-for-one, it's not a model, it's not a replica of a precise individual model, but some of their other models are. This one is based on a few examples, and I have to say the end result is gorgeous as a sword, but perhaps more objectively, does it seem to be a true replica of the original swords? Well, as one of my patrons said to me, actually, I have a patron who I gave a little preview on Patreon looking at these swords, and gave me some really good feedback. And basically he said what we don't know very much about is the metallurgy of the original blades, and that's kind of true. We know that they have a complex structure, we know they're probably made by folding, we know that some of them were probably spring tempered, but we don't necessarily know that for sure in terms of lots of them or all of them. But it does seem that in terms of the form, if not the metallurgy, because obviously there's modern steels being used and modern manufacturing processes being used, but in terms of the form, these seem to be really outstanding replicas of the original swords that they are replicating. So in terms of my golden rules, Matt Easton's golden rules of sword replication on the Matt Easton website linked below, it certainly measures up, this sword certainly measures up on that basis. It seems to be a faithful reproduction in terms of its form and its weight and all of its physical characteristics. It seems to be a faithful replica of the swords that it is claiming to replicate. So that's a big kind of 10 out of 10 on that one. Now in terms of the build quality, as you can probably tell already, I am very, very impressed, and I don't lightly say that something is the best replica sword that I've had for a long time unless I truly, truly mean it. This is a beautiful thing. Now, full disclosure, I haven't tested this sword. Obviously, I haven't tested it to destruction, which I'm probably not going to do. But I haven't physically tested it an awful lot beyond kind of dry air solo training. I haven't cut anything with it yet. I have purely observed it, handled it by myself, and judged it on that basis. There will follow videos where I do some physical things with this sword and other swords that I'll be reviewing soon as well. I will cut with this, I will compare it to other swords, comparable types of swords. I will compare this to European swords of different periods. In fact, the people at LK Chen have actually asked me to do that, and I'm only too happy to do that, because as you know on this channel, that is very much in my ballpark. That's very much the sort of thing I do. So I will be comparing this to other swords from other places and other times and seeing how it stacks up. But in terms of the build quality, so there are several things to check and judge. First of all, in terms of the overall precision and neatness of manufacturing, it is I would say it's a solid 9 out of 10. It is very, very up there. Everything is precise, all the lines are straight, all the fittings meet up very, very well. And I really can't criticise anything to do with it on that front. In terms of the attractiveness of the pattern of the steel, so that you're getting an impression of this complex structure to the steel. It's pattern welded, very, very pretty, and then it's got a very nice hand polish applied to it as well. So it has a look of a very high-end sword for, frankly, what's not a high-end price. And that is important to say, that for their price point, these are quite incredible, okay? By any price point, these are good, okay? But by the price point that LK Chen are selling these at, these are very, very good, okay? Now, in terms of the edge, if I look along the edge, first of all, I'll talk about the sharpness of the edge in a minute. If I look along the edge, it is perfectly true and straight on both sides. If I look along the flat, there is minor rippling along it. I suspect that these are hand forged rather than milled, and there is minor rippling, which you do find on original antique swords as well quite often, but it is minor. There's no twisting or warping, there's no bending like this or anything else. In terms of the casting of the bronze fittings, the guard and the pommel, they seem to be very crisp, very nice. Perhaps if I was being really nitpicky, I would say the edges could maybe be slightly smooth, a little bit more. But I haven't studied the originals, so that's not a historical kind of criticism. That's purely a functional kind of, in some cases, maybe they could just be very slightly sanded a little bit more, so they're a little bit smoother to handle, and there's no roughness, although there isn't much to speak of anyway. In terms of the way that the the blade fits into the guard, the tang passes through there, it is very tight. There is no movement whatsoever. Is there any rattle? No, none at all. Okay, I can bash this on various things. I'll do it on my leg. So you can see there. Good. Okay, there's nothing to criticise there. Everything is tight. This sword probably won't ring, because no, it won't ring because of its type of handle construction, but everything seems to be tight and sound. In terms of the grip wrap, so the grip wrap to me is perhaps a little bit on the shiny side, but I don't know what the material is. It could have a silk component, I don't know. The originals do seem to be cord wrapped, so that is authentic to this type of sword. And a really, really incredible detail that I didn't notice for a little bit, and I doubt that you'll be able to on camera, but I'll try and enable you to. So if we come in here, can you just see, sneaking out the top of there, on both sides, is a strip of shagreen, fish skin of some kind. So that's an amazing detail, and that's basically hidden underneath the cord wrap and over the top of the wood. So I know there's wood and then there's shark skin, or it certainly looks like shark skin. If it's simulated, it looks like the real thing. And you guys know that I deal with a lot of antiques, so I know I'm very familiar with, in fact, most of it's dogfish skin, but anyway, I'm very familiar with fish skins used on sword grips, and that looks like the real thing. And the cord wrap is very tightly done and nicely done. In terms of the cross section of the grip, it is really nice and flat and oval here, so it gives you very nice edge alignment, and it does go round, but at the butt end, at the pommel end, so it really doesn't matter that it's round at that end. It is flat at the top end where you want to feel the edge alignment. Whether that's true to the originals, again, there might be some guesswork in there, or we might have enough data from the originals surviving archaeological examples to know. I'm not sure, but in terms of functionality, that's what I like. You can hear that how easy it is to align the edge. I like to be able to feel what direction my edge is pointing in. So this is all superb. In terms of the scabbard, briefly, it's very crisp and nicely done. It's nicely lacquered. The paintwork, the decoration, which I understand might not be everyone's taste, but it's probably historical, is very precisely done. It's probably done with a stencil, but it looks the part, and it's very, as I say, it's very precise, and there's nothing really to criticise on it. And the bronze fittings are classy. I really like the tone, the alloy that they've used for the bronze, because it looks more like bronze than brass. It doesn't look like shiny brass. It looks like old bronze. And I've got to say, if you're getting one of these, I'm tempted to do this with this one myself. You can use various chemicals to actually age this bronze a bit, and I think that could look really beautiful if done, because it would kind of darken the recesses and kind of make the casting and the decoration stand out a little bit more. That might be an option that LK Chen wants to look at in the future. Now, briefly talking about it as a sword, as a modern person buying a sword to do test cutting or solo practice with, I imagine some people will buy these for Chinese sword forms, for practicing the various different forms of Kung Fu that use swords, or Tai Chi, or indeed some people will just be buying these for cutting up water bottles or tatami mats with. And some people will just be buying one because they're really interested in the weapon type. These are sharp swords, and they are made as sharp swords as the originals were. So these will be used for cutting. I will be using this for cutting in due course. Now, in terms of the sharpness, so there's sort of two factors more or less that I split things down into when I get replica swords. Number one, what is the edge geometry or fineness of the edge like? And number two, what is the actual sharpness like? Okay, so sharpness I would define as you know, can you literally shave with it? Can you cut through a piece of paper with it? And we'll look at that in a second. But in terms of fineness of the edge, these are very, very well done. The edge bevel is consistent, and it is fine, and it comes to a very fine edge. Now, in terms of the sharpness, what I would say is having experimented a bit, I am softly pushing my fingers against this blade, and I am not cutting myself. So it is not, at first sight, what I would call razor sharp, but the edge is very, very fine. So what I would say is that fundamentally it has mechanically a very good edge, but I suspect will probably benefit from some touching up with my DC4 stone and giving it a bit more bite to the edge. As a very simple demonstration, I've actually got various bare patches on my arm at the moment, so I have to find some hair because I've been sharpening knives recently. But if we just run this, I'll just do it a few points along the edge. So that edge does not shave anything, and that edge does not shave anything, but it did actually cut one hair off. So I can feel it's a very fine edge, but it's not taking hairs off. In terms of a piece of paper, I'll start from, in fairness, I'm not going to start down here, I'll start from about the middle of the blade and move towards the centre of percussion. Well, it does cut somewhat. No, not there. Let's try a bit further. No, it's not wanting to cut there. Let's try here. So the other side's a little bit sharper, and you know, a two-edged sword is never going to be exactly the same on both sides. So it does almost cut paper. So it's a very fine edge, but it's just lacking that little bit of bite to it that I will give it with a stone when I get a chance. I did want to review, before making this razor sharp myself, I did want to review this as it came to me, because I think that's only fair, so that anybody who's buying one of these swords, and I've got to be honest, if you at all fancy a Chinese sword, get one of these, because I love it. You will not be disappointed, and for this price point it's very, very, very good. I just want you to be fully aware though that it might not be as sharp as you might hope out of the box, but I want to emphasise that this is sharp enough to cut through water bottles, I feel almost certain, largely because of its very fine and nice edge geometry and fine edge, even if it's not as sharp as it possibly could be. One final thing I want to just point out to you, very interesting about this type of sword, which came from the earlier Bronze Age swords that were still around at the time of this Chu dynasty sword, and that is, you may up till this point have thought that this is just simply a straight profile taper straight down to until it gets to the point section. It's not. And what's very interesting when you start looking into Chinese swords from the Chu and Han dynasties is that actually their blades are more complex than you might have initially thought. And as well as this very interesting cross section, if you look carefully now, you might be able to notice on camera that it is broader up to that point, and then it steps down a bit like a carp's tongue, a bit like a European carp's tongue Bronze Age sword. And that's just very interesting detail. And I love the fact that they've replicated it in this particular sword, because it's an interesting talking point. But it also means that what you're essentially doing is removing a little bit of mass from the foible of the blade, which makes the sword a bit more nimble and arguably makes it better for thrusting through things. But you're keeping the width at the centre of percussion for maximum cutting effect. So it's actually a really cool compromise design that enables you to have a good amount of chop in the blade, but also still be able to move around quite nimbly and quickly at the tip, and to have less resistance thrusting as well. So a beautiful, beautiful sword from LK Chen, and this, as I will say once again, is my favourite replica sword that I've had in a long time. And I get, as you know, a fair number of things to review, and this particular sword has been living in my study since I got it, because I love handling it so much. It feels absolutely great, and it's also spurred me on to try and get a replica of a Chu period shield as well to go with it, because I'd like the full set. Thanks for watching. Check out the link below to LK Chen and this particular sword. I highly recommend them as a manufacturer and as a company to deal with. They've been marvellous so far. I also have some other things from LK Chen to review really soon. Other types of Chinese sword from Chu dynasty, also Han dynasty. We're going to look at the development of Chinese swords in that period, which is actually extremely interesting, relatively complex, and there's still a lot of unanswered questions about it. So give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you really soon again on Scholar Gladiatura channel. I'm Matt Easton, and I'll be reviewing other swords like this really, really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.